Sarah sat at the kitchen table, the soft light of dawn spilling through the window, casting a warm glow on the worn wood. Her hands cradled a steaming cup of coffee, but her mind was far away. She glanced up at the clock. It was almost time to wake Emily for school. The early morning quiet was her only moment of peace in a day that was otherwise filled with responsibilities. Sarah lived in a small, cozy apartment in Brooklyn. The walls were lined with bookshelves, overflowing with novels, history books, and children's stories, evidence of her profession and passion. As a librarian, Sarah found solace in the written word, a welcome escape from the complexities of her life. But lately, even the most comforting books couldn't distract her from the reality she faced every day. From the other room, Sarah heard a soft creak of the floorboards. She turned her head, knowing what was coming. Moments later, her father, James, shuffled into the kitchen, his face a mix of confusion and recognition. James was once a respected history professor, a man who could recall the most intricate details of ancient civilizations. But now, at 70, he struggled to remember the simplest things, like where he was or even who Sarah was. "Morning, Dad," Sarah said softly, her voice filled with a tenderness that masked her heartbreak. James looked at her, his brow furrowing as he tried to place her. "Good morning, Sarah?" he asked hesitantly. A small sigh of relief escaped Sarah's lips. Today was one of his better days. "Yes, Dad, it's me," she replied, offering him a warm smile. James nodded, though the confusion didn't completely leave his eyes. He took a seat at the table, staring at the cup of tea Sarah had already prepared for him. As he wrapped his hands around the mug, Sarah watched him closely, noticing the slight tremble in his fingers. The strong, confident man she once knew was fading, replaced by someone who was increasingly fragile and lost. Just as she was about to speak, a small figure bounded into the kitchen, bringing with her a burst of energy that contrasted sharply with the quiet melancholy of the morning. Emily, with her curly blonde hair and bright blue eyes, was like a ray of sunshine in their lives. She wore her school uniform and carried her backpack, already eager for the day ahead. "Morning, Mom. Morning, Grandpa," Emily chirped, her voice full of the innocence that only an 8-year-old could have. James's face lit up at the sight of his granddaughter. "Emily!" he exclaimed, a genuine smile breaking through the clouds of his mind. He might forget many things, but Emily's presence always seemed to anchor him, even if just for a little while. Sarah's heart swelled with a mix of love and sadness as she watched them. Emily didn't fully understand what was happening to her grandfather, but she had an intuitive way of connecting with him, as if she could sense the moments when he needed her most. Emily skipped over to James and gave him a big hug, which he returned with surprising strength. "Are you ready for school?" James asked, his voice tinged with pride. "Yes, we're learning about the planets today," Emily replied excitedly. "Did you know that Jupiter has 79 moons? That's so many." James chuckled, a sound that was becoming rarer these days. "That's wonderful, Emily. I'm sure you'll be the smartest one in your class." Sarah smiled at the exchange, feeling a brief moment of peace. But it was fleeting, like so many things in their lives now. She checked the time again, realizing they needed to leave soon. "Okay, kiddo, finish your breakfast. We've got to get going," Sarah said, standing up and moving to the counter to pack Emily's lunch. Her hands moved automatically, the routine a comfort in the midst of everything else. As she worked, she couldn't help but think about the day ahead. After dropping Emily off at school, she would take James to his appointment with the neurologist. It was a visit she both dreaded and knew was necessary. Every time they went, There was less good news and more talk of what the future would hold, a future that scared her more than she liked to admit. When they were ready, Sarah grabbed her coat and helped James with his. He struggled with the buttons, and without a word, she reached over and fastened them for him. He looked at her with gratitude, but there was also something else in his eyes, a flicker of embarrassment, perhaps, or shame. It broke her heart a little more every time. Emily held her grandfather's hand as they walked out the door, chatting away about the day ahead. Sarah followed behind, her mind heavy with thoughts of the past and worries for the future. She knew she had to be strong, for Emily, for James, and for herself. But some days, the weight of it all felt almost too much to bear. As they walked down the street, the sun began to rise higher in the sky, casting long shadows behind them. Sarah looked at the three of them, their shadows stretching out on the pavement, a reminder of the past that still clung to them and the uncertain future that lay ahead. But for now, in this moment, they had each other, and that was enough to keep going. The morning light was bright, and Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the warmth on her face. It was a new day, and she would face it as she always did, with love, patience, and the quiet strength that had become her constant companion. The next morning, Sarah found herself caught in the usual whirlwind of getting Emily ready for school. After the morning rush, they finally made it out the door. The brisk autumn air greeted them as they stepped onto the sidewalk, the trees lining their street, tinged with shades of gold and red. Sarah loved this time of year, but lately she'd been too preoccupied to fully appreciate its beauty. As they walked, Emily skipped ahead, humming a cheerful tune. Sarah smiled at her daughter's boundless energy, grateful for the joy Emily brought into her life. They reached the school gate just as the bell rang, the sound echoing through the neighborhood. "Have a great day, sweetheart," Sarah said, leaning down to give Emily a kiss on the forehead. "Thanks, Mom, I will," Emily chirped, her eyes sparkling with excitement. She gave Sarah a quick hug before dashing off towards the playground. Sarah watched her go, a small smile playing on her lips. Just as she turned to leave, she heard a warm voice behind her. "Good morning, Miss Thompson." Sarah turned around to see a man in his late 30s standing nearby, holding a stack of books. He had a friendly smile and a calm demeanor that immediately put her at ease. His dark hair was slightly tousled, and he wore a neatly pressed shirt and tie, clearly a teacher, though she hadn't met him before. "Good morning," Sarah replied, returning the smile. "I'm Michael," he introduced himself, extending a hand. "I teach 5th grade here. You must be Emily's mom." "Yes, that's right. I'm Sarah," she said, shaking his hand. His grip was firm but gentle, and his smile seemed to reach his eyes. "It's nice to meet you. I've had the pleasure of meeting Emily a few times during recess. She's quite the storyteller," Michael said with a chuckle. Sarah laughed softly. "Yes, she has a vivid imagination. She gets that from her grandfather, I think." Michael nodded, his expression shifting to one of curiosity and kindness. "I've seen you here a few times. You always seem so dedicated to Emily, and she's clearly a happy child. It's wonderful to see." Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. It wasn't often that someone noticed the little things she did for Emily, or took the time to comment on them. Most days, she felt like she was just getting by, doing the best she could in a situation that often felt overwhelming. "Thank you," she said, her voice softening. "I try my best. It's not always easy, but Emily makes it all worth it." Michael nodded thoughtfully. "I can only imagine. My sister is a single mom too, so I know how challenging it can be. But you seem to be doing an amazing job." Sarah felt a twinge of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time, something close to happiness. It was such a simple exchange, just a few kind words, but they meant more to her than Michael could have known. She realized she was smiling, a genuine, unforced smile, and it felt good. As they stood there, the schoolyard buzzing with activity, a comfortable silence settled between them. Michael seemed to sense that Sarah wasn't in a hurry to leave, and he didn't press her to continue talking. Instead, they simply watched as the children played, the sound of their laughter filling the air. After a moment, Michael spoke again, his voice gentle. "If you ever need someone to talk to, or even just a friendly face in the morning, I'm here. Sometimes it helps to have someone who understands." Sarah looked at him, touched by his offer. There was something about Michael that made her feel safe, like she could let her guard down, even if just a little. She hadn't realized how much she needed that, someone to share the weight of her days, if only for a few minutes each morning. "Thank you, Michael. That means a lot," she said sincerely. He smiled again, and this time Sarah noticed the small crinkles at the corners of his eyes, the kind that only came from years of genuine smiles. It was a comforting sight, one that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she sometimes felt. As the bell rang again, signaling the start of the school day, Michael glanced at his watch. "I should get to class, but I hope we'll see each other around." "I'm sure we will," Sarah replied, her heart feeling a little lighter as she watched him walk away. As she made her way back home, her thoughts kept drifting back to their conversation. She hadn't expected to meet someone like Michael today, someone who seemed to understand her struggles without her having to explain them. It was a small encounter, but it left a lasting impression on her. For the first time in a long while, Sarah felt a flicker of hope, a tiny spark in the midst of the shadows that had settled over her life. She knew there were still challenges ahead, that her father's condition would only worsen, but maybe there was room for a little light in her life too. But as the day went on, that flicker of hope was accompanied by a pang of guilt. How could she feel happy when her father was slipping away? How could she allow herself to enjoy even the smallest moments when so much of her life was consumed by worry and sadness? These thoughts troubled Sarah as she went about her day, but she couldn't shake the memory of Michael's kind words and warm smile. There was something about him that made her want to hold on to that light, even if just for a little while. As she picked Emily up from school that afternoon, she noticed Michael standing by the gate, talking with another parent. He caught her eye and gave her a small wave, which she returned, feeling a little flutter in her chest. It was a simple gesture, but it made her feel seen, like someone cared about her well-being, even if just in passing. That evening, as Sarah sat with her father, helping him with his dinner, she thought about the day's events. She was still deeply committed to caring for James, to being there for him in every way she could. But she also realized that it was okay to find a little happiness for herself, to allow herself to feel something other than sorrow. As she tucked Emily into bed, Sarah kissed her daughter's forehead and whispered, "Good night, sweetheart." "Good night, Mom," Emily murmured, her eyes already closing. "Did you have a good day?" Sarah paused, thinking about the morning's encounter. "Yes, I did," she said softly. "I met someone who made me smile." Emily's sleepy eyes opened just a bit. "That's good, Mom. You should smile more." Sarah's heart swelled with love for her daughter. "I'll try," she promised, brushing a strand of hair from Emily's face. As she turned off the light and closed the door, Sarah allowed herself to smile once more. Maybe it was okay to let a little light into her life. Maybe, in the midst of everything, she could find moments of joy, small, fleeting, but precious all the same. And maybe, just maybe, there was a new light on the horizon, waiting to guide her through the shadows of the past. The days blurred together in a routine of care and responsibility, but there were moments when time seemed to stand still, when Sarah caught a glimpse of the father she had once known. These moments were rare, but they were like treasures, sparkling in the otherwise dim reality of their lives. One crisp autumn afternoon, Sarah sat with her father in the small living room of their apartment. The afternoon sun filtered through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the walls. The air was filled with the scent of freshly brewed tea, a ritual Sarah maintained as much for her own comfort as for her father's. James sat in his favorite armchair, a worn but comfortable piece of furniture that had been with them for as long as Sarah could remember. He stared out the window, his eyes distant, as if lost in a world only he could see. Sarah watched him, her heart heavy with the familiar ache of uncertainty. Would today be one of the days when he remembered? "Dad," Sarah said softly, setting a cup of tea on the small table beside him, "would you like to tell me a story?" For a moment, James didn't respond. His gaze remained fixed on the world outside, where the leaves swirled in the wind, painting the streets with hues of orange and red. Sarah was about to let the moment pass when, suddenly, he turned to her, his eyes clearer than they had been in days. "A story?" he repeated, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I suppose I have a few left in me." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. This was it, a moment of clarity. She could see it in his eyes, the spark of recognition, the remnants of the man who had once enthralled her with tales of history and adventure. "Yes, Dad," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of hope and fear. "Tell me about the day you met Mom." James's smile grew as he leaned back in his chair, his hands resting on the armrests, fingers tracing the familiar fabric. "Your mother, she was the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. It was at a lecture at the university. I was the guest speaker, and she was sitting in the front row, taking notes." Sarah listened intently, her heart swelling with each word. She had heard this story before, of course, but today it felt different, more vivid, more real. It was as if, for this brief moment, her father had stepped out of the fog and was once again the man she had known and loved. She asked the most insightful questions. James continued, his voice steady and strong. "I knew then that she was special, that she saw the world in a way few others did. After the lecture, I gathered the courage to speak to her, and we talked for hours. I was smitten." Sarah smiled, tears welling up in her eyes. "She always said you were the most charming man she had ever met." James chuckled softly, a sound that warmed Sarah's heart. "We had our first date a week later. I took her to the museum. We spent hours wandering through the exhibits, discussing everything from art to philosophy. She was brilliant, your mother, and she loved you so much, Sarah. You were her world." Sarah blinked back tears, her chest tightening with the bittersweetness of the moment. "I miss her every day, Dad." James reached out and took Sarah's hand in his grip firm and reassuring. "I know you do, my dear. So do I." They sat in silence for a moment, hands clasped, the connection between them feeling as solid as it had in her childhood. Sarah wanted to freeze this moment, to hold on to it forever, but she knew better. These moments of clarity were fleeting, like wisps of smoke that slipped through her fingers no matter how tightly she tried to grasp them. As the afternoon light began to fade, so did the clarity in James's eyes. He looked down at their joined hands, his brow furrowing as confusion crept back in. Sarah felt the shift and braced herself for the inevitable return of the fog. "Sarah, where are we?" James asked, his voice uncertain. "We're at home, Dad," Sarah said gently, squeezing his hand. "You're safe here with me." James nodded slowly, though the worry didn't leave his face. He withdrew his hand, retreating into himself once more. The connection they had shared only moments before was slipping away, leaving Sarah with a hollow ache in its absence. That evening, after putting James to bed, Sarah found herself standing in the kitchen, staring out the window at the city lights. The loneliness that had settled in her chest felt almost unbearable. She knew she couldn't keep doing this alone, but admitting that felt like a betrayal of her father, of herself, of the promise she had made to care for him. The next day, after dropping Emily off at school, Sarah found herself walking towards the park where she and Michael had first met. She hadn't planned to go there, but her feet seemed to lead her of their own accord. She needed someone to talk to, someone who could understand the conflicting emotions swirling inside her. As she approached the park bench where they had shared that first conversation, she was relieved to see Michael sitting there, a book in hand. He looked up as she approached, and his face lit up with a warm smile. "Sarah," he greeted her, setting the book aside. "It's good to see you." "Hi, Michael," Sarah replied, her voice tinged with exhaustion. She sat down beside him, feeling the weight of the past few days settle over her. Michael noticed the weariness in her expression and placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch gentle. "You look like you've had a rough day." Sarah nodded, her eyes welling up with tears she had been holding back. "It's been hard," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "My dad, he had a moment of clarity today. He remembered Mom, and it was like he was himself again, just for a little while. But then he slipped away again, and I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this." Michael listened quietly, his expression filled with empathy. He didn't interrupt, didn't try to offer quick solutions. He simply let her speak, and that, more than anything, was what Sarah needed. "I'm so scared of losing him completely," Sarah continued, her voice breaking. "I know it's happening, that it's only a matter of time, but I'm not ready, and at the same time, I feel guilty for even thinking about anything else, about Emily, about my own life. I just don't know how to balance it all." Michael nodded, his hand still resting on her shoulder. "Sarah, it's okay to feel overwhelmed. What you're going through, it's one of the hardest things anyone can face. But you don't have to do it alone. You have Emily and you have me. We're here for you." Sarah looked at him, her vision blurred by tears. "I'm just so afraid, Michael. I'm afraid of losing him, and I'm afraid of losing myself in the process." Michael gently pulled her into a hug, wrapping his arms around her as she finally let the tears fall. "It's okay to be afraid," he whispered, "but you're not losing yourself. You're doing everything you can to hold on to the people you love, and that's something to be proud of. It's okay to find moments of joy, even in the midst of the sorrow. It doesn't mean you're forgetting him or what he means to you. It just means you're living, and that's what he would want for you." Sarah clung to him, the warmth of his embrace soothing the ache in her chest. She had been holding on so tightly, trying to be strong for everyone else. But in this moment, she realized she didn't have to carry it all on her own. There was strength in allowing herself to be vulnerable, in letting someone else share the burden. As she pulled away, Sarah wiped her eyes, feeling a little lighter, a little more at peace. "Thank you, Michael," she said, her voice still shaky, but filled with gratitude. Michael smiled at her, his eyes full of understanding. "Anytime, Sarah. You're not alone in this, and if you ever need a reminder, I'm just a phone call away." Sarah nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope amidst the darkness. She knew the road ahead would still be difficult, But with Michael's support, she felt a little more prepared to face it. She wasn't alone, and for the first time in a long while, she believed she could find a way to balance the love, the loss, and the life she still had to live. As they sat there, side by side, the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden light over the park. It was a beautiful evening, and for the first time in days, Sarah felt like she could truly appreciate it. Moments of clarity might be fleeting, but they were enough to keep her going, to remind her of the love that had always been the foundation of her life. And with Michael by her side, she knew she could find the strength to keep moving forward, one step at a time. As the days turned into weeks, the demands of Sarah's life grew heavier, like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon. James's condition was worsening. The moments of clarity that once gave her hope were becoming fewer and farther between. Every day she watched him slip further away, and with each passing hour, her responsibilities weighed down on her like an anchor. It was early morning, and the apartment was still cloaked in darkness when Sarah awoke. She hadn't slept well. She never did anymore. The worry gnawed at her, even in her dreams, and when she opened her eyes, it was there waiting for her, as if it had been lurking in the shadows all night. She lay in bed for a few moments, listening to the steady breathing of Emily in the next room. The comforting rhythm of her daughter's sleep was one of the few things that kept Sarah grounded these days. But even that comfort was tinged with worry. How could she protect Emily from the sadness that seemed to permeate their home? James's room was quiet too, but Sarah knew he would be awake soon, confused and disoriented, as he often was now. She braced herself for the day ahead, knowing it would be another test of her patience, her strength, and her love. When she finally got up, she moved through the motions of the morning with an automatic efficiency, making breakfast, getting Emily ready for school, checking on James. But today, James was more distant than usual. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the cereal in front of him as if he didn't know what to do with it. "Dad, it's breakfast time," Sarah said gently, trying to coax him out of his fog. She placed a hand on his shoulder, hoping to reach him through the haze. James looked up at her, his eyes dull and unseeing. "Sarah, where's your mother?" he asked, his voice small and frightened. Sarah's heart clenched painfully. This question was becoming more frequent, and each time it cut deeper. Her mother had passed away years ago, but to James it was as if she had just stepped out for a moment and would return any second. "She's not here, Dad," Sarah said softly, kneeling beside him. "But I'm here. I'll take care of you." James frowned, his confusion turning to frustration. "But I need her. I can't do this without her." Sarah fought back tears, her throat tightening. "I know, Dad. I miss her too." Emily, who had been quietly observing from the doorway, stepped forward. Her small face was serious, and her eyes shone with a wisdom beyond her years. "Grandpa, I'm here too," she said, walking over to him. "We'll help you, okay?" James looked at Emily, and for a brief moment the fog seemed to lift. He smiled, a small, sad smile, and nodded. "Okay, sweetheart," he said, reaching out to pat her hand. "You're a good girl." Emily beamed, her joy palpable in the midst of the heavy atmosphere. She had a way of brightening even the darkest days, and Sarah was endlessly grateful for that, but it also broke her heart to see her daughter taking on so much responsibility, to see her trying so hard to be brave when she should be carefree. As the morning wore on, Sarah found herself feeling more and more overwhelmed. The weight of everything, caring for James, being there for Emily, holding herself together, was pressing down on her, making it hard to breathe. She knew she was reaching her breaking point, but she didn't know what to do. It was during one of these overwhelming moments that Michael called. His voice on the other end of the line was calm and reassuring, a lifeline in the storm that Sarah's life had become. "Sarah, I was thinking, would you like to take a walk this afternoon, just to get out of the house for a bit?" Michael suggested. Sarah hesitated. The thought of leaving James, even for a short time, filled her with guilt. But at the same time, she knew she needed a break, needed to clear her head and regain some semblance of balance. "I don't know if I can," Sarah said, her voice tinged with exhaustion. "What if something happens while I'm gone?" "I understand," Michael replied gently. "But you can't pour from an empty cup, Sarah. You need to take care of yourself, too. I'll come by and sit with James if that makes you feel better. You won't be far, and I'll call you if anything changes." The offer was so kind, so thoughtful, that it brought fresh tears to Sarah's eyes. She realized how much she had been holding in, how much she had been trying to do on her own without asking for help. "Okay," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Okay, let's take a walk." That afternoon, after Michael arrived and settled in with James, Sarah and Emily put on their coats and stepped outside. The crisp air was a shock to Sarah's system, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere inside the apartment. She took a deep breath, trying to let go of some of the tension that had been building up inside her. They walked in silence for a while, the only sound the crunch of leaves under their feet. Sarah could feel the weight lifting slightly with each step, the fresh air clearing her mind, if only for a little while. "Mom?" Emily's voice broke the silence, her tone tentative. "Yes, sweetie?" Sarah replied, glancing down at her daughter. "Is Grandpa going to be okay?" Emily asked, her big blue eyes searching Sarah's face for answers. Sarah sighed, struggling to find the right words. She didn't want to lie to Emily, but she also didn't want to burden her with more than she could handle. "I don't know, Emily," Sarah said honestly, "but we're doing everything we can to help him, and we're here for him no matter what." Emily nodded, absorbing her mother's words. "I want to help too," she said after a moment. "I don't want you to be sad." Sarah stopped walking and knelt down in front of Emily, pulling her into a tight hug. "Oh, sweetheart, you're already helping so much just by being you. I'm so proud of you, and I love you more than anything." Emily hugged her back, her small arms wrapped tightly around Sarah's neck. "I love you too, Mom." As they continued their walk, Sarah's thoughts turned to the difficult decision she knew she would soon have to make. James's condition was deteriorating rapidly, and she was struggling to provide the level of care he needed. The idea of placing him in a care home had been weighing on her mind for weeks, but the guilt that came with it was unbearable. It felt like giving up, like abandoning him when he needed her the most. But she also knew that she was reaching her limit. The constant stress was affecting her health, her relationship with Emily, and her ability to care for James. She needed help, and more importantly, James needed the kind of care that she couldn't provide on her own. That evening, after Emily had gone to bed, Sarah found herself back on the phone with Michael. She needed to talk, to sort through the tangled mess of emotions that had been building up inside her. "I'm thinking about placing my dad in a care home," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "But I feel like I'm failing him, like I'm giving up on him." Michael listened quietly, letting her express the thoughts she had been too afraid to say out loud. "Sarah, you're not failing him," he said gently. "You've done everything you can, and you've given him so much love and care. But this is a journey that you can't take alone. It's okay to ask for help, to make sure he gets the care he needs. It doesn't mean you're giving up on him. It means you love him enough to make the best decision for him." Sarah wiped away the tears that had begun to fall, her heart aching with the weight of the decision she knew she had to make. "I just don't want him to feel like I'm abandoning him," she whispered. Michael's voice was steady and reassuring. "He won't feel that way, Sarah. He knows how much you love him, and even if he can't always express it, deep down, he knows you're doing what's best for him. You'll still be there for him, just in a different way." Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "Thank you, Michael. I don't know what I'd do without you." "You don't have to do this alone," Michael reminded her. "I'm here for you, and so is Emily. We'll get through this together." As Sarah hung up the phone, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. It wasn't an easy decision, but she knew it was the right one. The weight of love was heavy, but it was a burden she didn't have to carry alone. With Michael's support and Emily's love, she knew they could find a way forward, together. The next day, Sarah sat down with James and explained the situation as gently as she could. To her surprise, he seemed to understand, his usual confusion giving way to a rare moment of clarity. "Sarah, I trust you," James said, his voice full of quiet strength. "I know you'll do what's best for me, and whatever happens, I'll always love you." Sarah's heart swelled with emotion as she hugged her father, tears streaming down her face. "I love you too, Dad, always." In that moment, she knew they would be okay. The road ahead would be difficult, but they would face it with love, with strength, and with the support of those who cared for them. And as they moved forward, Sarah realized that the weight of love, while heavy, was also what kept them going. It was a burden they carried together, and with that, they could face whatever the future held. The day Sarah had been dreading finally arrived. It was a cold, gray morning, the kind that seemed to mirror the heaviness in her heart. The decision to move her father into a specialized care facility had been made, but that didn't make it any easier to follow through. She knew it was the right choice, the only choice, but the guilt and sadness threatened to overwhelm her. James was having a good morning, one of the rare, fleeting days when he seemed more like his old self. He was sitting in the living room, flipping through a photo album filled with memories from a life that was slipping away from him. Sarah watched him from the doorway, her chest tightening with a mix of love and sorrow. "Dad," she said softly, stepping into the room, "it's time to go." James looked up at her, his eyes clear and focused. "Where are we going, Sarah?" Sarah hesitated, the words catching in her throat. "We're going to a place where you'll be safe, where you can get the care you need," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. James frowned, his confusion evident. "I don't understand. Why can't I stay here with you?" Sarah knelt beside him, placing a hand on his arm. "I wish you could, Dad, but I can't take care of you the way you need anymore. This place, it's going to help you. They'll make sure you're comfortable, that you have everything you need." James looked down at the photo album, his fingers tracing the edges of a picture of Sarah as a little girl. "I don't want to leave you," he whispered, his voice trembling. Sarah's heart broke a little more at his words, but she knew she had to stay strong, for him, for Emily, for herself. "You're not leaving me, Dad. I'll be there every day, just like always. We're just doing what's best for you." James nodded slowly, though Sarah could see the fear in his eyes. He didn't fully understand, but there was a part of him that trusted her, that knew she wouldn't do this unless she truly believed it was necessary. The drive to the care facility was quiet, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional sniffle from the back seat where Emily sat, clutching her stuffed rabbit tightly. Sarah's hands gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white as she tried to keep her emotions in check. Beside her, James stared out the window, his expression distant. When they arrived, a nurse greeted them with a warm smile, but Sarah barely registered it. Her focus was on James, on helping him out of the car and guiding him through the doors of what would now be his home. Each step felt like a small betrayal, even though she knew it was what he needed. The room they had prepared for James was simple but comfortable, with a large window that let in plenty of light. Sarah helped him settle in, unpacking his things and making sure he had everything he needed. Emily stayed close, her usual bright energy subdued as she watched her mother and grandfather navigate this difficult transition. When everything was in place, Sarah sat down beside James on the bed. "How are you feeling, Dad?" she asked, searching his face for any sign of how he was processing all of this. James looked around the room, his expression thoughtful. "It's nice here," he said slowly, as if trying to convince himself. "But it's not home." Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat. "I know, Dad, but we'll make it feel like home, okay? I'll bring some more of your things tomorrow, and Emily and I will visit you every day. You won't be alone." James nodded, though he still seemed uncertain. "Promise you won't forget about me?" Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, but she managed to keep them from falling. "I could never forget about you, Dad. You're my father, and I love you more than anything." James reached out and took her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "I love you too, Sarah. You're a good daughter." Those words were like a balm to Sarah's aching heart. She leaned in and hugged him tightly, letting herself savor this moment of connection, knowing that these moments would become even rarer now. When it was time to leave, Emily gave her grandfather a big hug and promised to bring him a drawing the next day. As they walked out of the room, Sarah felt the full weight of the decision settle on her shoulders. It was done. There was no turning back now. The drive home was quiet, the reality of the day sinking in for both Sarah and Emily. When they reached the apartment, Sarah felt the emptiness of the space keenly. James's absence was like a physical presence, filling the rooms with a silence that was almost unbearable. Later that evening, as they sat together on the couch, Emily cuddled up next to Sarah, her head resting on her mother's shoulder. "Mom, is Grandpa going to be okay?" she asked, her voice small. Sarah stroked Emily's hair, trying to find the right words. "I think he will be, sweetie. It's going to be different, but the people at the care home are going to take good care of him, and we'll be there every day to make sure he knows he's loved." Emily nodded, seeming to accept this. "I just don't want you to be sad, Mom." Sarah smiled through her tears, pulling Emily closer. "I'm going to miss having him here, but I think this is what's best for him. And I'm so glad I have you with me, Emily. You're my little sunshine." Emily snuggled closer, her presence a comfort to Sarah in a way she hadn't fully realized until now. They sat like that for a while, finding solace in each other's company, until there was a knock on the door. Michael stood in the hallway, holding a bag of takeout and wearing a gentle smile. "I thought you might need a friend tonight," he said, his voice filled with understanding. Sarah's heart warmed at the sight of him. "You have perfect timing," she said, stepping aside to let him in. The three of them sat around the small dining table, sharing a simple meal and talking quietly about everything and nothing. Michael had a way of making even the heaviest topics feel lighter, his steady presence a balm to Sarah's weary soul. After dinner, they moved to the living room, where Emily proudly showed Michael her latest drawing, a picture of her, Sarah, and James, all smiling and holding hands. "This is for Grandpa," she explained. "I'm going to bring it to him tomorrow." Michael admired the drawing, his eyes softening as he looked at Emily. "He's going to love it," he said, giving her a warm smile. As the evening wore on, Emily grew sleepy, and Sarah tucked her into bed with a kiss on the forehead. When she returned to the living room, Michael was still there, sitting on the couch and looking out the window at the darkened cityscape. "Thank you for being here," Sarah said, sitting down beside him. Michael turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "You don't have to thank me, Sarah. I'm here because I care about you and Emily and James. We're in this together." Sarah felt a swell of gratitude and something more, something she hadn't allowed herself to fully feel until now. "I don't know what I'd do without you," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael reached out and took her hand, his touch reassuring. "You're stronger than you think, Sarah, but you don't have to be strong all the time. It's okay to lean on someone else." Sarah looked into his eyes, seeing the depth of his care and understanding. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to imagine a future where she wasn't carrying the weight of the world on her own, a future where she could share the burdens and the joys with someone who truly understood. The night had grown late, and the city outside was quiet, the usual hustle and bustle replaced by the calm of early hours. Sarah and Michael sat in silence for a while, simply enjoying each other's company. There was a sense of peace in the air, a feeling that, despite everything, they were going to be okay. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Sarah felt something shift inside her, a sense of acceptance, of coming to terms with the changes in her life. The decision to move her father to the care facility had been one of the hardest she'd ever made, but now, sitting here with Michael, she realized it had also been a step toward a new beginning. "I think it's going to be okay," she said softly, almost to herself. Michael squeezed her hand gently. "It will be, one day at a time." Sarah nodded, feeling a sense of calm wash over her. The dawn was breaking outside, and with it, a new chapter in her life. It wouldn't be easy. There would still be challenges, still be moments of pain and uncertainty, but there would also be love and support and the possibility of happiness. As the first rays of sunlight filtered into the room, Sarah, Michael, and Emily shared a quiet moment together, a small family, finding strength in each other as they faced the dawn of a new day. It was a beginning, not an end, and Sarah knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together.